Greetings, and welcome to the second part of my film review and historical accuracy commentary for Robert Schwenke's 2017 film, The Captain. For those of you who haven't seen the first part of my review, know that the purpose of this endeavor is essentially to dissuade you from taking the film seriously as a historical source for the Herold case by showing you how it holds up in terms of factual accuracy. Before we begin, I must give you a fair warning. The second part of the film is so rife with historical inaccuracies that pointing out all of them would take far too much time. By my calculation, I would have to chime in about 15 seconds and say, this didn't happen, and I don't want to do that to you. Instead, I will be focusing on the more glaring inaccuracies and either tell you what really happened or where I think the director got his inspiration from. So we're still at the party that Herold asked Schutte to organize, and he makes a confession of sorts to one of the prisoners and admits that he stole his uniform. Schutte and his wife are perplexed at first, but then interpret his words as a joke and begin laughing. Truth is, Herold was actually very careful to maintain his facade. I haven't come across any statements where he was said to have joked about stealing his uniform or not being who he said he was. Not in the presence of officials, at least. Contrary to what Robert Schwenke said in an interview, I don't think Herold wanted to be caught. The scene where the tied prisoners are made to run didn't happen, but I can spot several interpretations for this. The real Herold did tie a prisoner who had been accused of stealing a guard's food rations, ordered him to march, and when the man was only a few steps away, machine-gunned him to death. When Herold pardoned some of the prisoners, especially the hut leaders, and promoted them into members of his band, he had them tested, so to say, and some of them did shoot at their fellow prisoners, but this was after the destruction of the camp. Here we see Mrs. Schutte, whose first name was Doris, and not Gerda, wanting to shoot one of the prisoners herself. I have to defend her here because she did no such thing. The inspiration for this scene was taken from Reinhard Freitag's official statement, where he said that one of the girls in Herold's band, Erika Brachmann, allegedly expressed a desire to shoot one of the 5 Dutch resistance members whom Herold had sentenced to death. She didn't do it though, and neither did the real Mrs. Schutte. These two specific guys had worked in the show business and actually survived the war. One of them was the film director Heinz Kuckelsberg Alexander, and he saved the other one from one of Herold's massacres by telling Herold that his fellow actor was absolutely essential to the success of the colorful evening Herold had ordered. It really shows how arbitrary Herold's actions were. I think I can pinpoint the precise inspiration for this scene. In the case summary made by the British, they mentioned the sinister circus atmosphere created by Herold and his band, and this scene embodies it perfectly. In reality, once Herold took control of the camp, he and his men began to systematically torture and humiliate the prisoners. I recall reading about one instance when one of Herold's acquaintances, Captain Carton, visited the camp. Herold had Freitag force a prisoner to wade through the camp's ice-cold pond for everybody's amusement. Prisoners were forced to participate in so-called physical education, where they would be forced to perform exercises until their bodies broke down. An absurd and utterly sinister circus. There is a little detail here that I like. You see Herold pouring something into his wine. That's sugar. During his stay at the camp, Herold poured sugar into 2 bottles of French red wine and downed them both one morning. It was one of his little gimmicks. This here is a deleted scene, but I decided to include it nevertheless because it captures a facet of Herold quite well. He finally has enough of Hansen's bureaucratic interference and begins to shout at him. It's quite a contrast to his previous behavior, and it shows him sinking even deeper into the captain persona. For the real Herold, on the other hand, this was a common form of expressing his anger. He would often shout like a madman at people, insult them, hit them. He would tear things to pieces and trash entire rooms when he was drunk. He was just this terribly temperamental, quarrelsome, angry boy. Even as a child, he had trouble finding friends because he'd keep hitting the ones younger or weaker than him. He loved to cause a scene. He had no qualms about shouting at people in public, not just to humiliate them, but to have an audience for when he threw his weight around. He wanted everybody to see that he was in charge. Small aside, what's also not shown here is the fact that even after arriving in the camp, Harold continued to organize military reconnaissance missions every night, in which he participated together with his men. This scene is inspired by one of Harold's speeches. He loved to give these grandiose speeches. He loved feeling important, almost like the main character of a novel. But as I mentioned in my previous video, his pants fit him well, so he never gave any speeches in his underwear. It was a very amusing scene though, and this is something that the film does very well, this unexpected blend of comedy and horror. So the Allies bombed the camp on the 19th of April. I have heard varying opinions about this, with some historians claiming the bombing was intentional, and others saying that no, the bombing was by mistake, as they were actually trying to hit some anti-aircraft batteries located close to camp. Hansen had actually asked in vain for the removal of those systems for fear that they might attract enemy bombers. The real Harold was drunk at the time. In fact, Harold seemed to be alarmingly often drunk. And he tries to stop Hansen from opening the camp gates by brandishing his pistol at him. It's truly the worst time to be drunk, and the worst time to try and save some prisoners while a drunk 19-year-old with a gun is aiming at you. Schütte doesn't die in the bombing of the camp. In fact, as far as I remember, the only victims of the bombing are prisoners. There was an event that was left out of the film, namely, in the aftermath of the bombing, there were several prisoners who were severely wounded and in agony, but not dead. And in his official statement, Harold claims that the men were begging him to kill them because they were in such overwhelming pain. So he asks one of the prisoners, who had some medical training, to inject the men with morphine to make them lose consciousness, and then has the men shot. From the information that I have, it's a very ambiguous situation. We don't know if the men were truly unsavable, if it was a genuine mercy kill, or if Harold simply couldn't be bothered to load the wounded men in a car and take them to Papenburg or Leer. It's a shame they left this out of the film because it could have added a layer to the interpretation of Harold's character. Okay, so the camp is in ashes, and Harold gathers his remaining men and goes to the north in search of new adventures. And they find a mayor who's obviously getting ready to peacefully welcome the Allies. In reality, the man who's shot here isn't the mayor. He was a farmer by the name of Nikolaus Spark. Harold didn't sentence him to death. He was actually sentenced to death by Captain Cartham, who's also a local judge. Harold was asked by Cartham to take over the execution. Spark was hanged, not shot, in the middle of Papenburg, in the presence of the Nazi Party officials. Today, there is a plaque there commemorating his unfair death. I quite like this scene because I think it's the closest Hubacher comes to channeling how Harold really was. The air of authority, the bombastic speeches, the hypocrisy. Definitely one of my favorite scenes. Harold and his men begin partying like there's no tomorrow. Nothing much changes in Harold's character trajectory at this point, which might be in contrast to what was happening to the real Harold during that time. I say might because all I have is a theory, a hunch. I suspect that the real Harold lost heart in the war a little bit after the destruction of Camp 2. I suspect he might have realized that the Allies are unstoppable, and there are certain clues that potentially hint towards that. For example, he doesn't really organize military missions anymore. He tends to focus more on getting rid of what he perceives as traitors or spies. He seems to be somewhat unclear as to where he wants to go or what he wants to do. At one point, he tells one girl and her mom that he wants to try and fight his way back to Saxony to his own mother. And most tellingly, the same girl overhears Freytag threatening to shoot Harold if he didn't take more energetic measures to fulfill the Führer's orders. So, if her recollection is correct, Harold is being accused of slacking off, basically, which is a contrast to his previous very enthusiastic and tireless attitude. It could have been an interesting angle to explore if the film had been more factual. Right, back to the story. Harold gets his eye on a girl and finally has enough of Kipinski when the latter takes the girl from under his nose. I don't know what to think about this scene with Betty. The British authorities were never able to track Betty down, and therefore we don't get to hear her side of the story. She did not have anything to do with Kipinski, so this scene where he's pulled out from her bed never really happened. Betty was a Dutch girl who also spoke German, and who moved in with Harold in his fancy hotel room upon his arrival in Leer. I'm inclined to think that their liaison was consensual in reality. The thing was, the ladies tended to like Harold. He was good-looking, charming, funny, clever, and very well dressed. His grins were described as infectious. Paul Meyer, who made the Captain from Nowhere documentary in the 90s and who interviewed numerous people who had been involved in the events of April 1945, said in an interview that Harold had something in him of the kind of boy that would have made any mother give him her daughter's hand. And we do know that while in Lear, Harold had a different girl on his arm every night. So he had no problem with finding lady companions. And in case his charm and looks weren't enough, he also had an enormous sum of money on him, which he had illegally obtained from an imprisoned wealthy baker in exchange for the latter's release. He was ordering cases of champagne to his hotel room. The girls probably loved a guy who could show them a good time and make them forget about deprivation and war for a night. So this scene probably never happened, in my opinion. It's not a hill I want to die on, though. The fact that Betty was Dutch made her vulnerable, and although Harold hated rapists, he suffered from a severe case of moral myopia when it came to his own actions, so I'm leaving this question open. Kipinski doesn't get executed at Harold's orders. He survives the war and is never brought to justice for his crimes. Harold has two members of his so-called Guard executed. Their names were Sommer and Schramek. Sommer was accused of trying to give a woman morphine so he could rape her. And guess what Schramek was executed for? No, just guess. He allegedly went to a bar and passed himself off as a captain. And Harold has him executed for that. The party scenes were pretty accurate, although Harold tended to go out in civilian with Freitag and a few others, and tended to entertain girls in his lavish hotel room. Fun fact, the song that the ladies are singing here is the same song Harold sang in the beginning as he was juggling apples right after he found the captain's uniform. Nice bookends. There are a few crimes that Harold commits that aren't shown in the film. He withdraws 5 Dutchmen accused of espionage from prison and has them executed in a field. Afterwards, he shoots a mentally ill man in the middle of the city. Go to the middle of Leer in Brunnstrasse 1 and you'll be in the very place where Harold accused this mentally ill man of having sabotaged his car and shot him. I'm also convinced that Harold committed other crimes that we don't know anything about, because one of the witnesses remembered how he laughed about shooting somebody who resisted his looting. Worryingly enough, we don't know exactly what happened, so it's possible that this crime was never linked to Harold. Harold and his men get arrested by the military police. In reality, they got arrested at night at 11:45 p.m. Harold was with Freitag in the hotel bar when it happened. The Germans place Harold on trial for his crimes. The trial scene is very inaccurate. We know that Nikolaus Sparkt was hanged, not shot. The trial was actually far more uncomfortable for Harold. I spoke about it at length in the third part of my Harold project, but 3 of the 4 people involved in the trial actually wanted him dead. It was only through the interference of Josef Urbanek and Horst Franke, the Chief Justice of the East Frisian Military District, that Harold was conditionally released. The judge, the prosecutor, and the able seamen who took part in the trial were outraged that Harold was released. So in all fairness to the German trial, if it had been allowed to run its course, Harold would have probably ended up in a noose. And here we see our protagonist escaping and walking ominously through a forest of skeletons. My first thought was that it was a reference to the future exhumation of his victims. In February 1946, Harold and 50 others were ordered to dig up the victims of the April 1945 massacres and to rebury them in proper graves. It could also be a stylistic choice to see him leaving behind this trail of death as he melts away in the darkness of the forest. But now I'm having second thoughts about the significance of this scene. The skeletons are in a forest, and it's clear that they have been there for a while. The forest is also within walking distance of a German town. Could this be a metaphorical reference to the victims of the Nazi regime? We do know that thousands of people considered undesirable by the regime were executed in somewhat hidden and remote places such as forests. So it could be that Harold is walking into a former theater of Nazi violence. He doesn't seem to acknowledge the bodies. He's lost that empathy a long time ago. I wonder if this is meant to suggest that Harold himself is another crime of the Nazi regime. As the Nordwestzeitung said, I quote, "He is the personification of their teachings, the prototype distorted by murder of the youth they envisioned. They fed him all these things and then unleashed this terrible war under a terrible philosophy and created circumstances which brought out the absolute worst in him. Obviously, he's responsible for his own actions, and the real Harold certainly possessed the necessary cleverness to withdraw from the Aschendorfer Moor situation. But he didn't. I'm going to go on a tangent here and talk a little bit about the impact that Harold's actions had, because it was not limited to his victims, the people he murdered, directly or indirectly. I often thought about the pain that the survivors of Aschendorfer Moor might have felt and carried with them and passed bits of it to their children. I thought about the hundreds of parents, siblings, wives, children, grandchildren, and friends of the victims, and the pain they carried as a result of Harold's actions. Harold was like a hurricane which ravaged the Emsland and continued to haunt it and the people involved in this story, phantom-wise, long after his death in that grim room in Wolfenbüttel. Major Panchev couldn't let the case go. He wrote the first book on the Harold case 3 decades after the events. He kept copies of the trial documents and gave them to film director Paul Meyer towards the end of his life, and only after a year of tough wrangling. Another person who was affected by this was William Sholto Douglas, Grand Marshal of the RAF and the man who was in charge of the British military zone in occupied Germany. He appears for a few seconds in the third part of my Harold project when he signs Harold's death warrant. I wanted to know what he thought about the case, so I began researching him, and just then, his daughter published an extensive biography of him in which the Harold case is mentioned. Douglas called his days as governor of the British military zone as the unhappiest of his career. The fact that his duty required him, an opponent of the death penalty, to sign so many death warrants, and the severity of the cases that he had to review, made his PTSD, which he had developed as a result of his tumultuous service in 2 world wars, much worse. And the Harold case was one of those which haunted him in particular, and it undeniably contributed to his PTSD in later years. A bitter drop in a bucket of bitterness. When I read that, I was horrified at the sheer reach that Harold's actions had. His father, Harold Sr., had to sit in court and hear Harold's defense lawyer say how Harold was not raised in such a way as to be strong enough to resist temptations on the battlefront. He tore himself to pieces over this for the remainder of his life, even though I believe it's reasonable to say that somebody like Harold couldn't be created by a single family. He was very much a product of his time. From the film reviews I have read, viewers are split on this ending scene. Some liked it. Others thought it was an unnecessary addition which detracted from the value of the film. I personally liked it, and I liked it even more after I read an interview with Max Hubacher where he said that although some of the people Harold and his band were pretend harassing were paid actors, there were normal passers-by who willingly joined Harold and began harassing the paid actors. Unsettling, to say the least. And so we have the ending of the film. I covered his trials and his execution in the third part of my Harold project, if you are interested. In conclusion, the real Willi Harold was somehow better and worse than his film counterpart. He was undoubtedly courageous and charismatic and ridiculously self-confident, but far less endearing and more violent, volatile and cruel. I think my biggest problem with the film is that it portrays Harold's motivations in a completely false light. He was not initially a deserter, and this is the most significant deviation from reality, and it colors absolutely everything. Although he obviously wanted to survive the war, his main motivation was not surviving like in the film. It was to help Germany win the war and to live out his lifelong power fantasy of being a leader. This desperado action that he initiated and constantly improvised upon was not done out of cowardice. It was done out of ambition. If there's one thing I can hold against this film is the fact that it put me in the decidedly unenviable position of having to defend Willi Harold. I could have done without that. I spent too much time with his crimes and pondering the wave of pain and trauma he unleashed on so many hundreds of people that it's psychologically uncomfortable to step up and say, he wasn't a deserter, he wasn't a coward. But historians must be in the service of the truth, and that includes amateurs like me. Schwentke turns Harold and a story into a metaphor for the corruptive effects of power and authority, a metaphor for Nazi Germany. It works as a purely artistic endeavor, and the film stays with you for a long time. Much like the Herold case itself, the film is not easily forgotten. I stand by my initial statement that it is one of the best films to come out of Germany in the past decade, and it has earned its praise. But as a historical film, so to say, it falls, in my opinion, short. That's all I have to say for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.